This is my sandbox, and in my sandbox, I have created 4 workshop activities, 1 to demonstrate a cumulative assessment, 1 number of errors, 1 comments assessment, and 1 rubric assessment. But before I show you those, I'm going to show you how you would start out adding a workshop activity. To add a workshop activity, you have clicked the Turn Editing On button, and then you go to Add an Activity or Resource in the topic where you would like to add your workshop activity. And you scroll down until you see the workshop activity, and like always, you click Add. That will take you to a screen that looks really familiar. This part here looks like every other activity that you add in Moodle. You are asked to name your activity. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this Test During the Webinar. And then you are asked to add a description of your activity. So I have a description already typed up. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it in here. In this workshop, you'll practice using the CRAP test to determine if a source you have selected for your research paper is appropriate or not. And like always, you can check this box if you want this description to show up on your Moodle homepage, or you can leave it unchecked if you don't. That's just your basic setup, naming your workshop and putting in a basic description of it. Now, let's scroll down. The next thing that you have to choose is how you are going to do your assessments. And like I said, you have 4 options: cumulative grading, comments, number of errors, or rubric. A cumulative grading is going to allow the students to assign points to submissions. Comments are going to allow for comments only. No grade will be put in the gradebook. Number of errors is going to give you the ability to ask binary questions, yes or no type questions that the students have to answer to assess the submissions, or a rubric. For right now, I'll just go ahead and pick cumulative grading. Now, here you get to determine how much of the overall workshop grade is going to be based on the student's submission. In other words, the student's work. By default, that's set to 80%, but you can set it to anything you want. I'm just going to leave it at 80%. And if you want, you can add a grade to pass. Now, the next grade that you have to set up is the grade for assessment. You have to say how much of the grade for the overall workshop is going to be based on the student's assessment of their peers' work. By default, that's 20% of the workshop grade. But again, you can drop that down and set it to anything you want. But this and this have to add up to 100. If you want, you can set an assessment grade to pass. Okay, once you've done that, you can go to submission settings. Here, you are setting up what instructions for what the students need to do when they submit their own work. So this part is like any other assignment where the students are going to submit a Word document or an Excel document or something like that to you. So you just include your instructions for what you expect them to do. Type them right there. Submit a PDF copy or a URL link of a source you intend to use for your research paper. This source should be one you believe is appropriate for use in a scholarly research paper. So that's the instructions. That's what I want my students to do. Just submit a PDF of a source for their research paper. But this might also be where you have them submit a 500-word essay on such and such, or the rough draft of their research paper, or whatever. Now you can set right here how many attachments they can include, how big the attachment might be, and you can check this if you want them to be allowed to submit after the deadline. Once you've done that, you've done everything you need to do for the submission. Now, the second half of the workshop activity is the assessment. Here, in the initial setup of the workshop, all you can do is add the general instructions for the assessment and determine if the students are going to assess their own work. So, my general instructions for my little test workshop here are use the criteria described in the CRAP test to evaluate if the source submitted is appropriate for use in a scholarly research paper. Just the directions. And I'm going to go ahead and check to say that students can assess their own work. If I check that, then students will obviously be allowed to use my assessment form against their own work in addition to their peers. Okay? Those are the things that you must do. It won't let you go on if you don't do the assessment settings, the submission settings, the grading settings, and general. Now, there are additional things you can do. Under feedback, you can mark whether the students are able to give wordy feedback. In other words, something that they typed up, a paragraph or a sentence in feedback. You can say that that feedback is enabled and optional. You can say that it's disabled. Students can't give a paragraph of feedback. Or you can say that it is enabled and required. Enabled and optional is the default. So if you don't want that, you'll want to go into feedback and either disable it or make it required. Also under feedback, you are able to put in a conclusion of the workshop activity. The students are going to see that during the grading phase. And what this is maybe a little summary of what you hoped your students would learn from this activity. So in my case, for my little test workshop activity, I'll put in this activity, you work with the CRAP test criteria, apparently I can't spell, for determining if a source is appropriate for a research paper. You should apply the CRAP test to every source you choose for a class paper. So you can put that in as a conclusion. Another optional thing that you can set up is to allow for example submissions. An example submission would be one that you put in order to show the students either a good example or a negative example. If you check this, then you'll be able to provide the example. And then there's a drop down here, and you can decide whether looking at that, assessing that example is going to be voluntary, whether it's going to be required before the person submits their own work, or whether the example is available after the person has submitted their own submission, but it has to be assessed before they do their peer assessment. And that's obviously up to you. Some people would prefer to say that this submission is available after the students turn in their own submission so that they don't try to steal ideas. Some people may want to require the students to look at the example before their own submission so that they get an idea of what's expected. It's totally up to you. Then, like every other assignment in Moodle, you can set availability dates if you want to. And then these three settings we recommend that you don't mess with. Once you've got everything done that you want to, you click Save and Display. And now you're finally going to get to see what this looks like in Moodle. This is what you and your students would see at this point. And you can see the 5 different phases that I talked about in the PowerPoint. You have the setup phase, the submission phase, the assessment phase, the grading and evaluation phase, and the closed phase. And you can see that Moodle walks you through this. It tells you that you have set the workshop description, green checkbox. It tells you that you've provided instructions for submission, green check. But it does tell you that you have to edit your assessment form, gray checkbox there, and that you have to prepare example submissions. Since I said that I wanted sample example submissions, it tells me that I have to do them. If I had not checked that box, this would not be there, and neither would this link. Notice if I try to do my example submission first, it tells me you have to define the assessment form before you can provide the example submission. So let's go ahead and see, how would you do an assessment form? In order to edit any of the things that are required in each phase, you just click on the link. You can see that all of these that you can edit are links. So if I don't like my workshop description, if I want to change it, I can just click on this link and it'll take me back there and I can change it. But I'm going to work on this gray checkbox, edit the assessment form. And this is going to give me an accumulative grading assessment form because that's the type of grading that I chose. If I get here and I look at this and I say to myself, oh, you know what, I don't think I want the students to do points. I'd rather have them do comments. Then I would have to go back to my test workshop and I would have to go down to the administrative block and go to edit settings. And then I get back to where I can see this grading settings. And I could change this to number of errors instead and click Save and Display. And then when I go back to edit my assessment form, it looks a little bit different. Rather than getting to add points, I can only say yes or no things. Okay, so how do I make my assessment form? I put in under description what I want the students to assess. So I might say something like, does the submission have excessive, I hope I spelled that right, grammatical errors? And then I can either say no or yes. If I want to add another assertion, I just drop this down and I say, I put my next question in. Does the submission have the required number of sources? No or yes, etc. If I want to add more criteria, I can click here to add 2 more blanks, however long I want. If I want to see what this is going to look like for students, I can click Save and Preview. This is what the students will see. Does the submission have excessive grammatical errors? Check yes or check no and make a comment. And then the next question and the overall feedback. So once the students read what their peer has submitted, then they can go to this assessment form and kind of grade their peer. Okay, so once I have edited the assessment form in the setup phase, you see now I have the ability to add a sample submission. I have this little button. So I click the button and it allows me to put a title in, sample submission. You can call it anything you want. And I can either type in the content in line or I can upload a file, just like the students can do. So I'll just go ahead and upload a file and click Save Changes. And now it will ask me to continue to add a example assessment. And so I would go ahead and do that. So I can say no excessive grammatical errors and make a good comment here so the students can see the types of comments that you're looking for. Does the submission have the required number of sources? Yes, and you could put something like all the sources are scholarly, peer-reviewed journals. Good job. Something like that, you know, whatever would be a good example of a comment. And then you can put your sample overall comment here, and you can save and close. So once you've done that, you see you've got all green check marks in your setup phase. You have created a workshop description, instructions for submission, an assessment form that students will use to assess their peers' work, and you've created an example submission and an example assessment of the submission that students can look at. So you are ready now for students to see this workshop. So you push it to the submission phase by clicking the little light bulb. When you do that and click continue, you see that everything has gone, your green highlight has gone over here. And now students can see the workshop, what they're supposed to do, and they're able to make submissions. Let's look at an example of one where students have already done submissions. In this case, this workshop is in the submission phase, and Ellen Bloomfield has made a submission and Brittany Netherton has made a submission. In this phase, remember, the instructor can allocate submissions. In other words, the instructor says who is going to grade whose work. To do that, you click on the Allocate Submissions link, and you can either do it manually by adding a reviewer from the drop-down, or if you've got a big class and you don't want to do it manually, you can do a random allocation by choosing that each submission is going to get at least a certain number of reviews. And you can say here that participants can go ahead and start reviewing without submitting anything. And here you can add self-assessments. And once you've either done manual or random, you can see that Ellen is going to be reviewed by Brittany and by herself, since I chose self-assessment. And Brittany is going to be reviewed by Ellen and by herself, since I chose self-assessment. Let's go ahead and look at one that's in the assessment phase. Once everybody's turned everything in and the submissions are allocated, the instructor would then push the workshop into the assessment phase, and then the students can see what they're supposed to assess. You, as the professor, can see who has turned things in, who is supposed to review them, and what grades they have given. Here is a course where the students have been graded. Ellen has been graded by me, the instructor, and given a 67, and by Brittany, a peer, and the peer gave her a 60. Brittany has been graded by her peer, Ellen, and she has received a 60. And she has been graded by me, the instructor, and she's been given a 60. And you can see that if you want to, you can reassess as the instructor either one of the submissions that are available in your class. And then you can push your workshop to the grading evaluation phase. by clicking on the light bulb. And this is where you can choose. You see what the submission grades are. They are an average of the instructor's grade and the peer review. So Ellen will get a 63 for her submission. That's an average of 67 and 60. And then you will see she'll get 20 points, the full grade for her assessment. Both people are getting 20. This is where you can choose whether the assessment grade is going to be graded very lax, lax, fair, strict, or very strict. And your only option for the grading evaluation is comparison with the best assessment. Once you're satisfied with how your assessment grades are, then you push the workshop to closed, and the students will be able to see their grades in the gradebook. So if I go over to the gradebook for this course, then you can see for the one that we have pushed to the closed phase, they receive for their submission grade a 63 and for their assessment grade a 20 for a total of 83 points. Okay, that is how the workshop activity works. I just wanted to show you one last thing, and that was the rubric so that you could see the rubric grading, the way that it actually looks. We're going to go ahead and look at that assessment form. When you want to set up grading by a rubric, you put your criterion here and the descriptions of how many points are earned in your ranges here, and then I'll show you what this looks like in a preview. The students get an assessment form that looks like this nice little rubric, and so they just have to click whatever is the most appropriate answer in their opinion, and then they have a place for feedback. So the rubric is I really like this particular form of assessment. My two favorite forms of assessment are this rubric and the one where they do number of errors. So they choose a yes or a no, and they have to put in comments. Okay, that's a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, somebody asks, can I please send a copy of the presentation? I absolutely will. I can go ahead and put it in the handouts here. Everybody ought to be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint from the handouts section over there. If you have any trouble getting that, you can go ahead and email me. I'll go ahead and put my email address in here. You can go ahead and email me at kmanny@midway.edu if you have any questions at all on this topic. We will also be putting the recording of tonight's session on the center's website, and I will send a link out to all faculty for that recording. So you can have an opportunity, if you do decide to use the workshop activity, you'll have an opportunity to kind of watch the recording as you set it up. Okay? Okay, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. It was a long webinar and a kind of complicated topic. I appreciate very much you hanging in there for it, and I hope that you find some great uses for the workshop activity in Moodle. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, but I will stay in the room for a second until everybody leaves in case anybody else has any questions.